Gilbert King discusses Thurgood Marshall's defense of a capital case based on his Pulitzer Prize-winning book Devil in the Grove, Thurgood Marshall, the Groveland Boys, and the Dawn of a New America.
This particular case started with a 17-year-old girl named Norma Padgett. And she was, at the age of 16, she had already been married and separated from her husband. And it was sort of around town, the rumors were that Norma was being beaten by her husband. Her husband was sort of a ne'er-do-well at the time. And he was about 22 years old. And they tried to get back together, went out to a dance one night. Something happened in the car between them. And the next thing you know, she is on the side of a road claiming that she's been raped by 4 black men. When word got out, the Klan rolled into town and all the locals just started burning down the black community. This is in Groveland, Florida, 1949. So here you see 3 stellar members of the community. Prosecutor, who is Jesse Hunter on the left, Sheriff Willis McCall in the center, the big hat man they called him, and his deputy, James Yates. And this was the family of one of the alleged rapists. One of the alleged rapists named sort of saw what was happening, and he skipped town. And Sheriff McCall went up, got a posse of 1,000 men. They shot him down, killed him. I think they said something like 400 bullets were in the body. Unbelievable. But these are the 3 Groveland Boys. And this case is a lot like the Scottsboro Boys. It's just not as well known. And, you know, it's funny. I went through a lot of readings in Marshall. This isn't even a case that makes it to Marshall's biographies very often, and it was one of the most dangerous cases he ever got involved in. I'll sort of explain to you that. But there you see Sheriff McCall. He's sort of the notorious sheriff on the left, and he was every bit as important in enforcing the death penalty than the prosecutor. You know, what happened was Norma Padgett claimed when this first happened she couldn't recognize the victims. She didn't recognize them. Later on, after a talk with prosecutors and Sheriff McCall, she finally figured out who these men were, and she could name every single one of them naturally. And they were basically who Sheriff McCall considered troublemakers. The tall kid in the middle, 16-year-old Charles Greenlee, was in another jail at this point. He wasn't even involved with this, but Norma, they had to have 4 men, and so they just picked him. This was right after the alleged rape. This was the one of the editorials in the Orlando Sentinel. The supreme penalty, the Lake County tragedy, and basically they're already lining up the fact that this community is going to put these kids to death. This actually was played a large role in the Supreme Court verdict on this, which I'll read for you in a moment. This is just, you can see what happened after the rioting. This is really interesting. After the rioting, Life magazine sent a photographer down, like the day after, while they were still investigating this. And so you have sort of this real-time photo reportage of this murder case. This is the spot where the alleged rape was supposed to have taken place. Norma Padgett is standing way in front of the car there. Part of the agreement with the photographer was that he wouldn't photograph her, or if he did, he'd be from a distance. Here you can see Willie Padgett, that's Norma's separated husband. Jesse Hunter is the prosecutor, and Mabel Norris Reese is the reporter. They play a really important part of this case, which I'll explain to you later. And you can sort of see behind the prosecutor, that's Norma. She's just, the photographer just hit her back there. This is one of the most, I think, one of the most fascinating photographs that I've ever come across, and it doesn't look like much. It's sort of just telling you that something's happening in this little cafe, but this is sort of how the death penalty works, and this is how justice worked, and it's all right here in this photograph. This guy is by the name of Lawrence Bertoft. Now, he had a little cafe on the side of the road outside of Groveland, and he was the first person to see Norma Padgett that morning. And Norma Padgett came in and told him a story. But she didn't tell it right away. She sat down, had coffee with him, didn't seem to be hurt at all. And she said that she told Lawrence that she couldn't find her husband. She didn't know where he was, that some black men had come along and got in a fight with her husband, and she wanted to see if Lawrence would take her back to find her husband. That didn't fit the story of a rape. She said nothing about a rape. She didn't look upset. She didn't seem hurt. And so Lawrence Bertoft, whose father owned this cafe, when they came around to talk to him, they sort of put it in his head like, what about that rape? She showed up, she said she was raped by 4 men, and he said, actually, that's not at all what she said. And he told a totally different story. And so you can see the prosecutor in the foreground, Jesse Hunter, sort of trying to get this story out of Lawrence Bertoft. This is a 17-year-old kid. He's about to go off to the Army. And they're basically saying, you know, your father's got a nice place here. It'd be a shame if he lost his liquor license, all these things, threatening and sort of, and you can see Sheriff McCall and James Yates, his deputy, sort of glaring at him because they're used to getting their way in this town. These guys are stone cold killers, which I'll explain to you in a little bit. But they were absolutely feared in this town. And the sheriff was the most powerful man in town, more powerful than the prosecutor, more powerful than anybody. And they could make things happen. They made bodies disappear in the orange groves of Central Florida. They were killers. And so you can just see that look on them. It's just sort of, that's how you're influencing justice. Bertoft, by the way, refused to go along with them. And later on, he comes back from the Army and he stands up to the prosecutor in like a 45-minute cross-examination. One of the most heroic testimonies I've ever seen, considering, you know, that he had family members in the Klan, allegedly. They threatened to shut his father's business down, and his mother said, get up there and do what's right, which is unbelievable in the 1940s, to be honest with you. It's Thurgood Marshall, because you just got to see a picture of Thurgood. The first trial of the Groveland Boys was a disaster, and the NAACP did get involved. Marshall wasn't doing the criminal case, but he was sort of steering it from New York. It was reversed on, it went to the Supreme Court. They both men got convicted, sentenced to the electric chair. The third boy, the 16-year-old kid, he got life in prison. But Marshall knew when they were taking this trial that the way they selected the jury was just, there was already an opinion, Castle versus Texas, I believe it was, that had already said that you couldn't select jury members by hand, which is what they were doing. They were saying, he's one of the best blacks we have, he can be on the jury, and then they'd excuse them, but that's how they were doing it. There was no other way of selecting them, apparently. So once this case had gone to the Supreme Court, Marshall took the case. They knew they were going to win. In fact, Florida knew they were going to get destroyed. They sent up their attorney general, and he's just like, this is going to be easy for you guys, because the Supreme Court, like 2 months earlier, had just ruled on this. So they knew it was going to happen. But I want to read to you, because this was the, Justice Jackson wrote the opinion, and he's talking about the jury selection, but he reads a very strong opinion into this, and I'll just read it to you. The situation presented by this record is not different in essentials from that which was found a denial of due process in Moore v. Dempsey. Under these circumstances, for the court to reverse these convictions upon the sole ground that the method of jury selection discriminated against the Negro race is to stress the trivial and ignore the important. While this record discloses discrimination which under normal circumstances might be prejudicial, this trial took place under conditions and was accompanied by events which would deny defendants a fair trial before any kind of jury. I do not see as a practical matter how any Negro on the jury would have dared to cause a disagreement or acquittal. The only chances these Negroes had of acquittal would have been in the courage and decency of some sturdy and forthright white person of sufficient standing to face and live down the odium among his white neighbors that such a vote, if required, would have brought. To me, the technical question of discrimination in the jury selection has only theoretical importance. The case presents one of the best examples of one of the worst menaces to American justice. It is on that ground that I would reverse. And that was a pretty strong opinion. And basically they're saying that the sheriff who stood on the steps and said, I just got those boys to confess, this will all be taken care of soon, but there was no confessions brought into evidence. They knew that would get reversed. Even they were smart enough to know that then. But yet the word was out there that these 3 guys had confessed. It was all over the newspapers. The coverage was awful. And that's what Justice Jackson was talking about when he said, you know, it's one of the best examples of one of the worst menaces to American justice. One man who didn't particularly care for the Supreme Court decision was Sheriff Willis McCall. McCall said it was a decision that was influenced by subversives up in New York, a bunch of NAACP lawyers who got into the heads of the Supreme Court justices, and he didn't really care much for the opinion. But by law, he was required to go pick up the prisoners and bring them back for a second trial. And what do you know? They tried to escape. This is, McCall actually put these guys in the car, cuffed them together, and took them down a dirt road on the way back to the jail for the trial, on the eve of the trial. Samuel Shepard, who is the one in the Supreme Court opinion, Shepard versus Florida, is on the left. He was killed instantly. This is also another remarkable photograph for what it represents. This was taken about 10 minutes after the shooting. So after the shooting, McCall got on with his deputy and said, "Get the police back here. They tried to escape." The police showed up with a photographer. There was a town hall meeting. And they came and took this photograph. The flash fired. As soon as the flash fired, the prosecutor, who happened to be there as well, said, "One of those guys just moved." So Walter Irvin on the right was actually still alive. So Marshall had come down, he came down for the trial. He was going to conduct this trial himself. You can see him here with young Paul Perkins, who was, this was like one of his first cases out of college. This is the first case he ever was paid cash. He got $3.75 an hour to practice law. Before that, he was being paid in ham and oranges. So he was very excited to be working with Thurgood Marshall, needless to say. Marshall came down, and now he gets a chance to go into the hospital and meet Walter Irvin. He hasn't met Walter Irvin yet. And Walter Irvin tells a very different story about the escape. Irvin tells a story that they just went down a dirt road, and McCall just said, "Get out of the car." And as soon as they started to get out of the car, he shot them. Now he's cuffed to Samuel Shepard. Shepard falls, really can't go anywhere, can't run anywhere. He's stuck. He takes 2 bullets, one in the side, one in the chest. And there's a third bullet wound and they've accounted for all the bullets, but there's one bullet they haven't accounted for. And that was a neck wound. And this is where Irvin's story gets a little bit intense. And Marshall's hearing this. The reporters are hearing this for the first time. He said that he was lying on the side of the road, and McCall made that phone call to get his deputy back here. And the deputy drove back to the scene, took out his flashlight, and he's shining it down, and he says, "This one's not dead." He pulls his gun and fires it straight down at Irvin, hits him in the neck, goes right through his neck. Okay, so now you have 2 versions of what happened in this story. You have McCall's version that there was an escape, that these 2 guys were coming at them, and McCall was backing up and firing his weapon. 6 bullets. 5 of them were accounted for because they were in the bodies of the victims. The 6th bullet was unaccounted for. So if you believe McCall's story, that bullet would never be seen because he got shot in the neck while he was being attacked. But Irvin says that the deputy came back, shot him straight through the neck. So the FBI hears this, they go back to the scene, they find the blood spot, they start digging, and 10 inches under, they find the bullet. So it is Irvin's story after all. Remarkably, the FBI sat on this evidence and never released it. It just kind of died in the files, along with the bullet information. Very strange that this would happen. But these are the things that happen when you have a state attorney who's a known segregationist. They just managed to cover this up. In fact, the reason McCall was not indicted after evidence like this was that the judge in the case, the criminal case, said that, let's just go by the coroner's report. The coroner's report was very accurate as to what happened. The coroner's report was made up of 6 of Willis McCall's friends who said it was self-defense. And so McCall was never charged on this. There's James Yates, the deputy, who's the one who fired the bullet. The second trial did go forward, and it was pretty much, even with Thurgood Marshall representing, there was just no way that they were going to win, and they knew that. It was 12 white jurors. They knew what they were up against, and they were just not going to do it. One of the things that they were up against was falsified evidence. This is James Yates, the killer. You can see the newspaper articles that were running at Scotland Yard, please don't take our Yates. This was, Yates was in charge of putting the evidence together for this case. And what he did was he found these, he was supposedly this forensic genius. He was able to make footprints of plaster in Paris in the sand that put Walter Irvin at the scene of the crime, alleged crime. What he really did was he confiscated Irvin's shoes and went home and made footprints and brought them in for evidence. Marshall actually hired a very sophisticated forensic expert who worked for the FBI. He did the Lindbergh kidnapping. He was very adamant that these footprints were false, that there would have been a different way of convex impressions, and he said these were false. But the jury, all the prosecution really had to do was say, who are you going to believe, these Negroes up here, or are you going to believe our fine deputies? And this was exactly how it played out. So they got their verdict, they got their death sentence. At the time, actually, Florida was getting such bad publicity for this case that the governor actually stepped in and offered a plea to Walter Irvin, said, we can end this now, just take life in prison, we'll stop going for the death penalty, just, confess, just say you did it, that's all you have to do. And Marshall's strategy was to he was hoping that Irvin would take the plea. He really knew that Florida meant business and they were going to kill him, and that he really encouraged him. But Walter Irvin said, well, what do I have to do this? And Marshall explained to him, he said, you have to go before the judge and say that you raped Norma Padgett. And he said, well, you can say it for me, I'm not saying it, I didn't rape her. And he wouldn't say it. And this was to save his life, basically. And Marshall was trying to persuade him, say, we can get this taken care of later, just save your life. Because there's ways we can influence the political process and take care of this. And he was encouraged, but Irvin would not lie. And his mother wouldn't lie on the stand. His mother could have saved his life too by saying that Walter was home, but the family just would not lie, and he would not admit to raping her, which is pretty interesting. And here you see Jack Greenberg. I don't know if some of you know him. He was head of the NAACP, or the Legal Defense Fund, for a while. And this was one of his first cases. Greenberg was interesting because he had stormed the beaches of Iwo Jima. And how I asked him, were you scared? And he goes, not as scared as I was in Groveland, because the night before trial, the Klan was circling around his hotel, and he was putting like dressers in front of the doors. I mean, he was absolutely scared out of his mind. The second trial was interesting because Marshall, here's the dynamic at play here. You have an African-American lawyer, and he is supposedly questioning a white victim of rape. And there were all sorts of things that Marshall would not do. And one of them was he was not going to stand before a jury of 12 white rural men and question the integrity of this woman's character. It was called the flower of white Southern womanhood. That would be considered so untasteful and that an automatic conviction. So they were very careful about that. So the only way the only defense they could mount was one of mistaken identity, because that didn't impugn her reputation. They're saying, well, we're not saying the rape didn't happen. We're just saying you selected the wrong people. And she was very adamant about recognizing these men. Now, actually, when I went through the FBI files were sealed for 60 years. So I just got them released a couple of years ago, and I went through them, and they are fascinating because they include a lot of off-the-record comments. And so you had the police chief, telling the FBI, giving this statement, and then pulling the FBI guy to the side and saying, I'll tell you what really happened here. And so those things are in the record. It's pretty fascinating. But Norma Padgett, when she was doing her FBI statement, it was completely different than what she said on the stand. But of course, this never came out in the trial. So she contradicted herself. You could say she committed perjury in one of those statements or the other. But that's how hamstrung Marshall was in this defense. Now, what's really interesting, I showed you earlier the picture of Jesse Hunter, the prosecutor, and Mabel Norris Reese, who was the white reporter. After the shooting, when McCall shot these two guys, they started to have a change of heart. Now, this is the only time I'd seen this. The prosecutor started to leak material and information to the NAACP. So what they were basically doing, he would not go, he was going to go ahead, he was going to prosecute for the death penalty, but behind the scenes, the prosecutor was leaking material that would be helpful to the defense, which was, I had not come across that before. And in fact, the sheriff, McCall, was so upset by this that he leaked himself through one of his, he was friends with the assistant prosecutor, he leaked to the NAACP that the prosecutor was in on the murder with him. And so this showed up in Marshall's office, and Marshall just dismissed it out of hand. He figured it out. He said McCall's trying to drag the prosecutor down because he knew the prosecutor was leaking this. So after Jesse Hunter wins this conviction and gets Walter Irvin sent to the death penalty, the electric chair, what he does is he writes the governor and says, we got it all wrong. And he says, I think you should find a way to stop this right now. And this infuriated McCall because McCall was the one who really ran this county. And so McCall started accusing him of suddenly falling into the communist hands, becoming senile. And one of the things that's interesting, and this is the will to win, like the prosecutor, Jesse Hunter, would not stop the case. He had to win it. And to the extent that he went to win this was kind of remarkable. I think you'll find it pretty interesting. He, in his closing argument, he stands before and at this point, Marshall and his assistants are just making, one long list of prosecutorial misconduct. At the very end of his closing argument, Jesse Hunter stands up, walks over to the rail and starts talking to the 12 men on the jury. And he says, gentlemen, I haven't told anybody about this, but I have a terminal disease. And this is probably going to be my last case. And I sure would like to go out with a win. And I wouldn't lie to you. So if you wouldn't mind, just let me go out as a winner. And Marshall didn't even object at this point. They're just making a list of all these things. So those were the kind of things that they were up against. Another thing that was interesting was Jesse Hunter in the second trial, when they brought the forensic expert up, Hunter was just walking up and down the aisles making fun of the witness, and the judge wouldn't even stop him. So he was saying, what a fancy man with your fancy explanations, and he was yelling this stuff, and at one point, you can see in the transcript, can you get him to stop, Your Honor? Proceed. And it was just going on and on like this. And so the case was, the second trial was kind of a carnival in a lot of different ways. But, so yeah, that was...
And Irvin testified, right?
Irvin did testify, but it was one of those things where he didn't know what happened. And that Marshall made a point of that, saying, this is not the behavior of someone, technically, it was one of his neighbors. They lived near each other in Groveland, Norma Padgett and Walter Irvin. And what's strange is that Irvin gets up on the stand and he basically says, I saw them on the side of the road, we helped them fix the car, and then we drove away, which was true. And they went back to bed and woke up the next morning to go to work when the police showed up. And Marshall tried to make the point, he goes, in all my years, I've never seen a black man who rapes a neighbor and goes to work like nothing happened when they left her alive. It made no sense to him. And so that's how he knew that Irvin was innocent, but he really knew when Irvin refused to say that he could have saved his life, and he refused to just say, I raped her. One of the most fascinating parts of this story to me is Marshall actually hired a spy to go down to Florida, a young girl who was just anti-capital punishment. And she went down south, and she had this world peace pin that she wore around, and she went around to all these different people in this Klan community and said, I want you to sign my petition against capital punishment. And she went down and she got all these people to sign in Bay County. And one of the things she did, which was fascinating, she got Norma Padgett to sign that petition. And see, they were country Baptists, and they didn't really have a strong opinion. They had a strong opinion about guilt or innocence, but they weren't really in favor of capital punishment. And so by this spy, who I never was able to find her, she had a fake name, and Marshall just hired her from a detective agency. She went down there and got McCall, tried to get McCall to sign it, and McCall, get out of here, shoot her away. But she did get the Padgett to sign that. And so it's sort of this activism in a way. She was a detective and a spy, but she was also an activist. She really strongly believed, she was very anti-capital punishment. And by her going around, she went fishing with Norma Padgett. She went under the guise of wanting to buy real estate in Groveland. And so they were very friendly, even in this little Klan community, and they were against capital punishment. And so that was one of the factors that made the governor, Leroy Collins, actually pardon Walter Irvin. It was, you know, a lot of different factors, but one of them was seeing that the victim, in this case, was willing to sign that. I will add that it doesn't end quite that happily, because Sheriff McCall found out about that petition and mounted this big campaign to press charges because there was a communist loose in our neighborhood and she was getting to sign capital punishment, and they were under a ruse, and he tried to get Norma Padgett to recant it and say that was not my signature. He tried everything, but he was unsuccessful. So Walter Irvin's life was spared. Walter Irvin had a pretty strange, he served 19 years in jail, and he got out, I think it was 1968. And within a year, he decided he wanted to go back to Lake County because he was forbidden, but one of his uncles had passed away, so he wanted to go back for the funeral. And so he had to alert Lake County that he was coming to Lake County for a funeral. He got to Lake County and they found him dead in a car. So Mabel Norris Reese, who's a big part of this story, she just immediately says, McCall got to him. Like 20 years later, McCall got to him. Nothing was ever proven. You know, the coroner just sort of hung up and said it was natural causes. Marshall never believed that. And in fact, Marshall was sitting as a justice on the Supreme Court. When he got news of this, he still called Hoover and said, I want an investigation in McCall. McCall was like a nemesis of his for many years, and he never forgot that. So that was Walter Irvin's fate. Yeah.